And I think we should shift gears to BRICS since China has entered the conversation here. Of course, we keep mentioning Russia and Brazil as well. But my first question is, and of course, I'm going to be interrupted by one of our two pets here. There we go. I don't know how much of him you could see. I think you could see his nose. Usually they come at the end, but I guess this is an early warning with the Basset here.
I just have to confirm with Rafael, how long do you still have available? Because you have the radio show in...
more 15 minutes, I think.
Sure. So we definitely want to shift gears to BRICS. And so my question is, to what extent is the concept of Chimerica, which was the economic entity and the integration of China and America, is still relevant? Because some analysts say what you've been saying is that, yes, it's been slow, but there is a decoupling happening and China is looking for other markets. But other people say that, no, the two are so integrated that it's just not even possible for China to decouple from the US to any significant extent.
Well, that's even one of the reasons why there are many skeptics about de-dollarization, for example. But from what I have seen in news, especially from the last two years, and especially after Nancy Pelosi decided to pay unwanted visit to Taiwan, basically. And there were many interesting memes during that, during what happened at the time. But I've noticed a kind of change in how the Chinese elites saw the West since that flight from Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. And since then, we have seen many news, especially in the high-tech industry, where the Chinese seem to be attempting to make their production lines a bit shorter, transferring some of their economic relations from the United States to South Korea, for example, or to other regional countries. I seem to remember that China and South Korea signed some semiconductor agreement some months ago, or in the beginning of the year, or something like that, where before that it was the kind of the specific kind of product that they were receiving from the United States. We have seen recently, for example, that China has begun selling in Saudi Arabia public debt titles, papers in dollar, basically creating a parallel dollar market in Saudi Arabia, which of course uses dollar, but it's basically giving control to China to a part of international dollar trade, weakening the dollar. So I'd say that, and even these meetings between United States authorities, both Biden and Blinken, and Chinese authorities, of course, there are always the official speeches and announcements. But of course, there's of course always the things that they don't say. But even if we take only the things that they say, there was one of these meetings, I think, between Blinken and Xi, where they talked about the economic relations between China and the United States, in the sense that they didn't want it to be to change it too quickly. So they made it more or less clear that yes, things are happening, but we don't want it to happen too quickly. And I think it's better for both parts of this equation that any kind of decoupling that, in my opinion, seems to be happening very, very slowly, but that any kind of decoupling will be extremely slow, where little by little we have seen, for example, I think this month or last month, more sanctions against some Chinese companies, especially in the high-tech sector, as always. and the Chinese by themselves also trying to find new sources of raw materials or of technological parts for their industry. So I think the idea of Chimerica is basically nowadays it can be considered outdated. Um, it was something, of course, that seemed very plausible. And it's interesting that in the 90s, that created even some degree of apprehension from Russian specialists, from Russian geopoliticians, because in the 90s, yes, it seemed that things were extremely good between China and the United States, and that, of course, worried Russian patriots. But already at the time, it seems that the Chinese elites were. I don't know if I can say that they changed their minds because, well, the Maoists would say that Deng Xiaoping always wanted to things to become like they are now with Xi Jinping. I don't know if that's how he was already thinking about at the time. But in the 90s, there were already some very important changes in the sense that China was already beginning to build more complex stuff. It was growing out of the status of a sweatshop nation to becoming a basic industry nation where they were already, for example, doing reverse engineering and beginning to build um, copies of Western products, but copies that were day by day better and more complex until the point where we are right now.
So, would you say the relationship within BRICS is dominated by China the way the G7 is dominated by the US, or is it a more equitable relationship? Because, yes, China is a huge economic power, but it seems to not be interested in exporting its cultural values the way the United States would, in addition to having that kind of economic control. How do you view the situation within BRICS?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you because I think there's most people don't actually understand because most people are very accustomed to dealing with the United States. I have almost daily debates on X trying to prove to people that unipolarity is abnormal. That no, won't have a Chinese unipolarity or a Russian unipolarity or anything like that because we are living in a very specific moment. And these universalistic pretensions are pretty much connected to some specific messianic elements in the culture and identity of the United States mostly, but also of France and of the Western world in general. And these elements, though there are other kinds of messianic thought and especially in religion, in other civilizations, it isn't actually the same thing because if we pay attention, for example, to the idea, to both the Russian and Chinese idea of empire, for example, it's something closer to, for example, Neoplatonism in the sense that, of course, you have the one, but the one develops itself into multiplicity. So it's the kind of course, for example, there's some interesting differences between the multipolarity idea or multipolarity theory between, for example, Alexander Dugin as representative of a kind of Russian thought and Jiang Qigong as a representative of a Chinese thought. Where, for example, in Jiang Qigong's thought, multipolarity is connected to an idea where, for him, China, of course, is more or less the center of the world because it is, in fact, it's the biggest economy, it's a powerhouse by itself, but where the other countries are and the other civilizations are autonomous and relate themselves to China in a mutually beneficial way. It's very different from what we see, both in, for example, in French philosophical thought, or American philosophical thought, political philosophical thought, or British political philosophical thought, where there's a kind of a more forceful universalism that we can perceive it very clearly, and that's mostly absent from Russian thought or a Chinese thought. So no, I don't think that the Chinese would want to. I don't think they control the BRICS the same way that the United States controls the G7. The Chinese word has weight, of course, but I have never seen the Chinese trying to interfere, for example, into cultural or internal laws. When you do a deal with the IMF, you always sometimes they ask for things that aren't even connected to economics, like, oh, to get these lending, you need to approve LGBTQ etc. laws in your country. What does have to do with economy? There's nothing to do with economy. And the Chinese don't actually do that. I have many interesting talks with African patriots, and they always say this absolutely the same thing. They can't take it anymore from the West, because what we see in the European countries themselves, or Latin American countries, also happens in Africa with promotion of abortion, mass abortion, all these gender laws and gender identity, etc. And to the Africans, which have a much more traditional country because of historical factors than other civilizations, it is even more aberrant than even to us. And dealing with the Chinese or the Russian, there's never anything even close to what the US asks of them. The US, for example, is imposing or has imposed sanctions on Uganda, for example, because they outlawed gay marriage. And so, in other words, it's a country that sometimes needs help for economic reasons, because they still can't produce enough food to feed their country with their current technological level in agriculture. But well, then because they banned gay marriage, then you're going to starve them to death. So that's how Washington works, and it's something that, in my opinion, is alien to the Chinese and Russian thought.
I think that's really interesting because you mentioned Kissinger in the beginning, and I'm thinking of his book World Order from, I think it's around 2014, so he's well advanced in his age. And the way he describes Chinese mentality is very much in the way that you just described it, coming from a Chinese philosopher whom I haven't read. But basically, yes, he talked about China being the middle kingdom, right? The two characters for China sort of being the primary country around which everyone else sort of aligns, right, in a circle, but everyone has their own equal power according to their, their status. They're not going to be they're not going to be subject to some of these cultural issues that you just mentioned. And at the same time, Kissinger was obviously very much involved in Nixon's splitting China away from the Soviet Union and the China policy, which was very interesting in the 1970s. But Kissinger was also involved in talks, for instance, like the nuclear talks in the early 1970s. But he seems to really misunderstand Russia and the way Russia operates. So it was very interesting for me to see that book where he seems to understand China, at least the way that I would understand it, and really miss Russia and call it an enigma and just not even try to, to understand Russian philosophy and Russian foreign policy.